Welcome back to Campus Compact 20 virtual gathering. I'm Marisol Morales, and I serve as the Vice President for Network Leadership with Campus Compact. And we're about to get started with our next session titled Living Out Our Value of Equity, Love, Fake Equity, Social Transformation in Higher Education, presented by Erin Okuno, the Executive Director of the Southeast Seattle Education Coalition and creator of the blog Fakequity, Nanci Luna Jiménez, President of the Luna Jiménez Institute for Social Transformation, and Nyeema Watson, Associate Chancellor for Civic Engagement at Rutgers University, Camden, and myself. So originally this was meant to be a fireside chat, so that's what we're gonna try to embody in this virtual time. But before we get started with that, just a few things. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. Just a few housekeeping items that we want to share before you get started. So please note that by participating in this event, you're agreeing to abide by our code of conduct. Our staff will be sharing that in the link in the chat now. We want to make sure that this is a safe space for respectful, constructive conversation. So we would appreciate you taking a moment to familiarize yourself with the policy. Next, if you have any questions for us, simply type them into the Facebook Live or YouTube chat. Our staff will be compiling those questions and moving them on to us, so feel free to, pop them in anytime. They'll be sending them to us, and we'll be answering those questions at the end. And then if you have any technical issues, also feel free to put that in the Facebook or YouTube Live chat, and our staff will help to address those issues. So we're going to get started. I just want to give some context for this session. If folks are not familiar with love or living out our value of equity, that is how Campus Compact has been framing our equity work. And just the story behind this, in 2018, I was asked to give a presentation at our Mountain West Campus Compact at one of their events. And maybe about the week before, I think it was April, as I was getting ready for what my comments would be, it was a really heavy week here in the United States. We had the mass shooting at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We had the killing of two elderly African Americans at a grocery store in Louisville, Kentucky by a white supremacist. And it was just a really, really heavy week. And so as I was sort of getting ready for this, I thought about the quote by Dr. Martin Luther King, that darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can. And so from that, I started thinking about the ways in which our institutions or programs are thinking about equity. And I've always been fascinated with the concept of love as a leadership tool, love as a value in how we do this work. And so that is kind of the framing of our living out our value of equity, the conversation that we're going to have today. For those of you who've been on, you see that I've moved locations. And so I'm actually on my couch with my girlfriends, colleagues, sisters in the struggle. And so we're just going to have a conversation with you all and hope that you will join us as we move forward. So my question to you all is, I'm really big on story sharing. I think that's an important part of how we make connections and how we learn about each other. So I would just invite each of you to share your story about how you got into this work. What makes equity part of what you do in your work and in your life? And Erin, if you want to start us off.
Hi, well, thank you for having me. I'm in Seattle, and one of the really neat things about doing these virtually is perspectives from all over the place. Fakequity started as out of frustration. I wish I could say it was a love story, but it really was. I was in a meeting, and your typical everybody sitting in a horseshoe talking, and a presenter was talking about equity grants that her organization had received, and she was talking about how her very white, mainstream, historically white organization was enacting this grant. And I was listening, I was like, that, doesn't feel right. I was still fairly new to race work and equity work. So I raised my hand and said, I was like, hey, that's great. Can you tell me how you're partnering with the community? Can you tell me how you're actually engaging with families of color to inform your practice, to inform the writing of what you're doing? And she gave me a very runaround answer. And I came home and I flopped on the couch and more like flopped and started typing out a message to my friend Heidi, who is a racial equity consultant. She emailed back with one word and she's like, Fakequity. And that was the birth of this. And then over time, we started blogging more. And Marisol, listening to you, one of my favorite blog posts on the Fakequity blog is written by my friend Heidi, and it's about love and how we have to be in relationships with people and being there's a basis of love, and everything that we do with racial equity work, some of the greatest gains that we make are because of human relationships where you can get to know people. And there's an emphasis on having good relations and being in just relations with people. And that's really what drives my work. One of the, I think, looking back over the past 62 days of COVID and the stay-at-home orders, one of the things I really miss is just having lunch with people. And it's something over just being with people at a small restaurant where you're being served by the omas, the Korean omas, or the immigrant community, or just others, and being able to shake, to be with people and hear their stories in a very informal setting. But on the flip side, I'm very grateful that so many of those relationships are strong and in place so that we can continue to do our work remotely. And there's enough relationship there where we're able to continue to push boundaries and say, okay, who needs help right now? What are we missing? How can we reach them? Who's the families that don't have internet access so that we can find them and keep their students learning? So I'll stop there, but thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. Nyeema, for you, how did you get into this?
I really liked how you framed this, Marisol, because I got into it because I love my city. This started years ago when I was a student at Rutgers University, Camden, and at the time talked to our provost about a position that they had, was an associate provost for outreach. And I said, I really want that job. I know I'm about to graduate Rutgers, but I think I can do that. And what the person's role was trying to connect with the city of Camden. And I don't know exactly what he did because I was a pretty engaged student at the time. And we had an office on campus called CASE that oversaw volunteerism and service. And so I worked with them, but I never heard anything about the university as an institution intentionally engaging with the city of Camden. I worked with faculty who created their own after-school programs and volunteered with them for about 15 years, as a student and afterwards. And the university was always like, if you want to do those things, great, go ahead, but not an intentional focus. So I find it interesting that, my lifespan has taken me to this point where now, being someone born and raised in the city of Camden, a city that is, significantly challenged. We are, a few minutes away from Philadelphia, but sadly have had the moniker at times of, one of the most dangerous cities in America. We've been highlighted by CNN, Barbara Walters in the worst way, and not to dismiss those things, but never really focusing on a national scale, the assets, the positivity, the majority of people here who are, struggling, but, just trying to do right by their families. And so when this opportunity came around to kind of be engaged in this work, to be this linchpin between the university and the community, to be this person whose job it was to think intentionally about how can we take all of the resources of Rutgers University and work in concert, in partnership, and I know people have heard, probably a lot through the conference, these mutually beneficial, relationships really just set my soul on fire. And it's because I love my city. It's made me who I am. It's given me, kind of the fortitude and the resilience to press on. And I think that as, anchor institutions, a big part of our role should be that we have to engage, intentionally with the communities in which we're situated in. And for the lion's share of us, we're in predominantly, historically underrepresented communities, low income communities, high poverty, whatever name you want to give it. And so how do we think about equity in that space from every practice of the university, whether it's hiring the janitor or hiring a faculty person, whether it's, for people like myself who lead these efforts or who work in these efforts, to critically reflecting on how students who are from these communities engage in this work. And so, Erin, you're absolutely correct. Like, this is about relationship building at its core. And if you don't care and love other human beings, you're not going to be able, I think, to exist in a democratic society. And so, doing this work at Rutgers Camden has allowed me a platform to kind of, live out this work in a really intentional way, to call out, at times, whether it's, my own institution or others, and getting them to think a little bit differently about how they engage or the work that should be done. But it's a great time to be in this space, because we can have so much positive change if we just, work together and think about how we engage a little bit differently.
Absolutely. Thanks. And Nanci, for you, I've known you for a while. We've done some good work together, and I've learned so much from you. And so I'm thankful that you're in this space with us. But how did you get into this work? I know this story, but now
you do know the story. But let's see if I can put the story in this context. I just want to say I love being hanging out on this couch with all of y'all. Like this, like I feel like I'm home, and there is a sweet sisterhood and the thread of relationship. I mean, this is the core of the work that we do. And the way that we think about transformational and just relationships is about how to care and know about people, even maybe, or especially the people who we think we have nothing in common with, the people who we vehemently disagree with, or maybe even whose way of being would threaten our very way of being, right? It's how do we stay value-based and live in the value of love in the midst of attack. And I can tell you, I started, so my sort of consciousness raising happened as a first generation student of color, and connecting with and building relationships mostly with other students of color, particularly in the period of divestiture. So the whole movement was happening around apartheid and anti-apartheid movements in South Africa. And I knew how to be an activist in the mindset of I'm right, you're wrong. And if I can shame you or educate you or in some way get you to see the way I see the world, everything's going to go better. But especially my life. I mean, I did have a global perspective-ish, but mostly it was like, I need you people, and you can fill in the blank, white people, people with money, men. It didn't matter what the binary that I was operating out of. And then I landed in this workshop with a woman who eventually became my mentor. Her name is Lillian Roybal Rose. And if you don't know her, I'm sorry. And if you do, you're blessed. So I went to one of her workshops that she was holding at the YWCA in Watsonville, California. I just left my PhD program, and I was in so much righteous pain. And it really was there in that workshop where I heard her say that no movement you are a part of is going to be any healthier than you are. And I wanted to argue with her, like healthy to me was like an indulgence. I didn't have time to go running or eat well was all one of my first thoughts. But then I didn't realize what she meant healthy was like, basically that my pain was running through my activism. It was running through everything. It was driving me and was making me sick. And I had to really look at the fact that the first person that I didn't love was me, that I didn't cherish and love me. And I wanted, my movement work was based on what about me? What about my people? What about what's happened to us? And I get it. Like we have in the United States been systematically lied to. We have been given systematic misinformation about other parts of the world and about who we are in relationship to other parts of the world and in relationship to ourselves and our own history here in the United States. And so there was a big part of me, I was trained as a historian. I really believe in the power of knowing where we come from. Through Line's my favorite podcast in the world, because I really do feel like if we don't have a long view in the United States. Anything earlier than 1980 is ancient history. And yet we're formed by these past experiences, both as a people and me personally. And I didn't feel like I had the tools or the understanding that to be in relationship with other people, truly just caring, loving relationships, there's a level of vulnerability and awareness that I need to bring about my own self, and that I need to create space for them, to invite them, not to force them. You cannot force vulnerability. And I think that's one of the things that's confusing. I can live vulnerably. I can live in vulnerability, and it can be an invitation. And I remember Lillian saying, you will, when where you are is harder than where you fear to go, you'll make the move. And I just keep remembering that for myself and anyone else, that if I can hold space and compassion, like where I am isn't yet hard enough to move, and I don't get to judge myself, and I don't want to judge someone else. And so how do I figure out how to build the relationship with what they have available to them? And my dad would always say, love them for who they are, not for who they aren't. And I just remember I can't keep waiting for, like, for example, white people to be who I want them to be. How else can they be except in a system that socialized them to be clueless and seek comfort and have disconnect from each other? And yet I want them magically to show up as connected, clued in, loving allies that understand and get equity when they've been systematically lied to and have been given no tools to grieve that loss and disconnect.
Thanks.
And that's why I started this work. Yeah.
I actually have that quote up in my office.
Which one?
The one from Lillian about when you leave. And then your other favorite podcast is Compact Nation podcast, right?
Absolutely. Second favorite. Absolutely. Thank you. That's good.
Thanks. I know for me, like, I got into this work initially as a student, and I took an ethnic study course on U.S. colonialism of Puerto Rico, and it would just open my eyes to such a dynamic community that even though I was kind of a part of in terms of ethnicity, it wasn't something that my parents ever really connected to, right? They really tried hard to get us out of the neighborhood because that was success. And for a whole bunch of other reasons, but being able to come into that neighborhood and see the love and passion and the fight that folks had for providing access, for standing firm in our right to exist, to have voice, to self-determine, was for me like both a realization of like my own power, and really it's centered on loving who we are as Puerto Ricans, as colonized people, and understanding how that dynamic like impacts what happens in our community, and being able to make that connection between the macro and the micro. And I always hold that as my community here in Humboldt Park, Chicago, and the leaders who really just fostered in me that deep love of community that I've been able to kind of continue in all the places that I've gone to work, and in the way I view relationships, and the way that I see university community partnerships. So thank you all for sharing those stories. And I think the more that we can share those with one another about what brought us here, the more connected we can be in a relationship. So this question is for you, Erin. You talked a little bit about how kind of the fake equity term came up, but can you tell us a little bit about the blog? How long have you had it? And like, what are some of the things that you write about in there? What are some of the things that you're hearing from folks about the blog? When I first learned about it from the folks at UW, I was like, oh my God, that's a perfect term. That's like higher ed is steeped in that. So like, talk to us a little bit about that.
Fakequity, the blog, is we publish weekly every Friday. So oftentimes Thursday night between 9, 10 to about 2 a.m. I'm sitting on a couch writing. And some of the things we write about are racial equity, community engagement. Sometimes if I'm lucky, we can get some really great blog posts. One of the things I'm really excited about is I have a white ally who is part of the disabilities justice community. And so she's written for us, and I've learned a lot about it. So one of the things that I really hope the blog does is it also encourages us to think more deeply and differently about equity and how it shows up in different ways, such as I understand a lot about race. I have a lot more to learn, but I have a little bit of knowledge about it. The blog pushes me to think more, but it's also pushed me to think about gender. It's pushed me to think about disabilities, language access. And I also enjoy when people say like, wow, it's like, I learned something and I'm still wondering about this. I'm like, wow, I'm really kind of wondering about that too. Let's explore it together. The term fakequity itself, it's, I wish I could, as I explained earlier, it didn't come out of love, but I hope that it perpetuates and it pushes all of us to think about our values a little bit differently and change a little bit of our behaviors. I do a little bit of advocacy work in my organization. And one of the things I have to remember, and I try to remind others who are joining me, is like, if we think back 5 years ago, think about how much progress was made. But if we, Nanci, and listening to you, if we think about activism in the moment, it's can feel like such a struggle. So I hope the blog over time also gives us a little bit of a record of like, okay, this is where we were and this is how far we've come.
Yeah, I think that evolution piece is so important, right? The ability to start off with kind of your own work and think about how it progresses. Nanci, a lot of your work is kind of focused on that, right? The internal work that folks need to do, and then and how they transition to making that into broader movement. Can you share with us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things that was really radical for me when I walked into Lillian's workshop was that she started with a shared experience that we all have as human beings, which I know when we start to talk about equity or racial justice or other kinds of economic justice, we already feel polarized, right? There's the haves and the have-nots, the us and the them, that idea. And one thing that I learned very profoundly from Lillian, and then in following her work, and then building my own organization and doing my own work as a practitioner, but also as a human on the planet, is that we've all been targeted first as young people. And this concept of adultism was really key for me to understand, even though I wanted to fight with it, because I don't know how you grew up in your families, but ours was like, you don't let on what didn't go well in your house. And I certainly felt that as a young person of color, like if we talked actually honestly about what happened, we'd get taken away from our parents. And then there's this whole idea that, you know, as a Puerto Rican Mexican child, like you respect your parents above all else, and they've sacrificed so much for you. So my experience, all that, you know, socialization was really at odds with this idea of understanding what adultism was. And I wanted to be like, oh, well, that must be people who have child protective services or are violently abused. And Lillian was like, no, every young person experiences adultism because it's the way in which we're demeaned or minimized or not seen as fully human. And when I heard that definition and I was able to really let it in, I was like, oh, that's kind of the core basis for every oppression. Every oppression takes some aspect of a human experience and makes it less human. And that's the excuse for targeting that group with oppression. And when I really went back and looked at, you know, the experience of being a young person in this society, you know, I had to really grieve the places where I felt like I didn't have voice, or I was forced in many ways to take on certain patterns of good girl. Like I took on good girl and high achieving girl, often to the detriment of my health in ways that separated me from my peers, but also left me disconnected in a lot of ways from myself and my community. And we all of us had to take on some patterns to survive our childhoods because we couldn't heal from the experience. And this was the other really radical concept, was you can't oppress people and not have feelings about it. Like, we're all hurt. And yet our society then says, well, if you're going to start to show feelings about how you're hurt, we're going to further target you. So like if you were a little person and you got hurt by something and you started to cry, some of the messaging was either like you'd get hit, right? Or you'd get isolated. We're going to send you to your room until you can not act this out. And we internalize all of those messages as young people. And so is it any wonder that we have these pent up feelings about oppression, and we either go numb with them, and, you know, again, our society profits on our ability to numb on these, right? From like, you know, substances to activities, whether we're talking about, you know, alcohol or work, or isolation, those all numb a bunch of feelings down, right? Or we see a lot of rage and anger and upset, which it's not that it's not justified, it's just that it's not workable to build relationship built on rage. And if we need transformational relationships to create social justice, then we need places and spaces for us to feel the feelings that we've been numbing out, or we've been turning on a high, like a full, like fire hose faucet experience. And so that's really why, for me, the core practice that I learned that weekend in Watsonville, California, has become the basis of work in my life, and really getting more and more people into a place where they're willing to listen and be listened to, and create spaces to show and share some of those early experiences that really set us on the course for how we're showing up in our worlds today, or not showing up.
Right.
in the way that we'd like to.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that also makes me think about, the individual work that has to happen, but how the individuals show up in institutions and either continue to replicate that or transform that. So Nyeema, you're in an institution of higher ed, like where do you see that either being transformed or continuing to replicate itself? It doesn't have to just be at, your institution, but across the board. I know that I've talked to many folks from different institutions, and the feeling of, higher ed sometimes being a toxic space for us to do this work, and like where community engagement falls in that, while you're trying to do that work of relationships when institutions have had a history also of, causing harm to communities. I know my own alma mater, DePaul University, was part and parcel of the gentrification and displacement of the Puerto Rican community in Chicago, and how it reconciles that as an institution with the community. Where have you seen that come up in higher ed community engagement?
Yeah, one of my first vivid memories of being a student at Rutgers Camden was, walking on campus and, I see someone looking at a building. I'm like, oh, can I help you find where you're going? Older Puerto Rican gentleman. And he was like, yeah, this used to be my house. And I was like, well, what do you mean? The university owns this building.
Right.
Yeah. He was like, yeah, they do now. So I think it is, challenging to do this work well and to do this work with a basis of social justice in institutions that have disenfranchised or disinvested or negatively impacted a community. And you have to unpack that first before you can do any of this. And so I know for us, when we started this work, we had to go on about a year-long listening tour of how horrible Rutgers Camden was to the city of Camden, to residents, to the people who were our neighbors in North Camden, which is the community adjacent to us, and hear about how we didn't show up, how we took over land, how we would effectively lock down the campus so that young people, could not come through on bikes or couldn't be here. And so we had to kind of listen and reckon with that before we could go out and say, here we are, we want to have a different approach to this. We want to engage with you in a way that is not to the benefit of the university, but using whatever resources we have to address the needs that you have, that you see. And so I talk about this with other people, for a lot of us who do this work, we work with a lot of K-12 programs, school districts. How do we do after school programs or college access work? Because we know the disproportionate numbers of first generation students getting into higher ed and completing it, or especially underrepresented students. But you have to ask yourself, why? Are you doing this to increase your admission numbers? Are you doing this to enhance your marketing around diversity and equity? And if you're doing this on the surface and you can say, I've gotten X number of kids from our local community into the university, are you also through your engagement efforts addressing and making visible the structural issues that led to why the university needed to develop those programs in the first place? I like to sometimes visualize a space where universities don't have to do engagement work in this way, and coming in and addressing some of these societal needs, because as a society, we would all be addressing these needs. When Nanci was speaking, I was thinking my dissertation and my research is focused in childhood studies. And so I put children at the center of my stories and value their voices and make them visible. But a concept that I learned about from the legal community and this scholar, Derek Bell, was interest convergence. That, others will not do something that benefits you unless it benefits them. And so how do you either get people to that place of understanding this mutual benefit? But that's really kind of a sad way of looking at it. And so how do we get our faculty, our staff, and our students to kind of think critically about the challenges of the world and not simply go out and do these engagements because they feel good? You can get a certificate in it, you can put this on your resume, but you're having these deep conversations about structural inequities that you're also changing. So if we're going to do this K-12 work, or we want to get kids into college, great, but are we changing how we train our teachers? Are we holding ourselves more accountable to that? Are we working with school districts on education policy or curriculum reform? How are we handling food insecurity? In the age of COVID, how are we helping students understand it's great to make masks? I am not like, send me some if you have them. But structurally, why are African Americans being disproportionately impacted because of this? And so when you think of this work and you go into it, you have to marry the engagement with these critical conversations. And sometimes it starts with you unpacking your history, unpacking your story, unpacking your pain of what the man institutions have done for you, or to you, or how you feel about people outside your community coming in, wanting to help or change before you can be successful in this work. But you have to kind of dig into this in a much deeper way in order to claim success as an institution.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll open it up for all of us to kind of respond. But that makes me think of like the importance of the critical conversations, right? Like, how do you, especially when a lot of it is like, we as a society have not really embraced the conversation about race or inequity in ways that we can have these conversations in critical ways that don't continue to either hurt or people feel rejected or uncomfortable with these conversations. And I'm a firm believer, like, you're not gonna get to a place of being able to, of resolution, of healing, unless you have space for those conversations. And they may be uncomfortable and they may not sit with you, but that's also the place of potentially the greatest growth, is when you are able to sit in that discomfort, analyze it, think about it critically. So like, everyone's thoughts on that. Nanci, you look like you want to say something.
I do. I was waiting to see if Erin was wanting to jump in. I didn't want to presume, but I think there's a couple things that come to my mind, which is, in the approach that we do around our work around personal transformation and healing for social justice, often people will say, like, but you have to change systems. And what I often will say is, well, who are systems? Like, systems are humans. And the places where we still carry in confusions left over from the ways that we've internalized oppression, you're going to see replicated in our inability or finesse in disrupting dominance and changing policies, but more importantly, in creating policies that are truly inclusive and equitable, and what that means to live in a value-based way, right? Because policies in a certain way, well, I won't have a policy conversation. I'll just leave it there. So, and then I think the other thing that, is really struck by Nyeema is about the idea of shared interest. And I know it can sound cynical, but I wanted to see if we can for a minute, like, kind of layer it on the idea of racial justice for a minute, because my experience has been that this, and particularly this narrative around privilege, which I have found to reinforce the very inherently paternalistic nature of racism from white people towards people of color, is this idea that it is in their interest to give access. Like, so that idea is then their access, or it is then their interest, rather. And I think, again, one of the things that I really took me a while to integrate into my being and my way of thinking is this notion that privilege, and when you hear the word privilege, right, most people think of it's an honor. A privilege is an honor or a recognition. And this idea that those who have power are honorable, or that is an honored position, reinforces the superiority inferiority just by nature of that language. And then if you take it to the level of, like, well, I have something you want, then what gets internalized is that I have less. What's internalized is that I am deficient. What's internalized is that if I want what they have, again, this is the us-them dichotomy, then I need to either become like them or take from them. And it's just a zero-sum game. And I feel like the work, I mean, when I started this organization 26 years ago, I was very clear, I want to end racism. I want to end racism. I think you can't end one oppression without ending all of them, but that's the thread of the blanket I was going to pull on to unravel. And I thought, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to work with all these people of color and communities of color as we work to end racism. And then I was like, I don't know, somewhere halfway down this journey, like 10 years later, I was like, oh no, I'm going to be working with a lot of white people because racism isn't our issue. We have internalized racism, tons of it. Don't get me wrong. It's a body of work that we get to have. But for white people, and this is what I really learned from Lillian, is that if they don't go home and fall in love with themselves as white people, not as individuals, not like my family that comes from Nebraska or my, American Revolutionary, Mayflower ancestor, but as a collective, which, we as people of color get collective. Like I can get us collective in an instant. Also, I think females get an idea of getting collective in an instant. But one of the losses, one of the costs to non-targets, whether it's men, whether it's white people, owning class people, is this deep isolation and disconnection from group and heavy, heavy shame that somehow inherent in being a member of that group, which has been the dominant group and has perpetuated, policies of genocide and exclusion and racism and colonization and imperialism. How do you not feel horrible about that? And so the ask.
There are some people that don't feel horrible about that.
Well, I think those people are numb to it. And I think there's a difference between numb and connected. And when and I think that's got to be, I love that you said that, Marisol. That's the first part of this work, is there's a project of unnumbing. I mean, it literally is, we have to make a decision that we want to unnumb as a community, as a nation. And I get this as a USer, there's this pull to be like, we're the best nation on earth. And without any sort of critical awareness about how we have gotten to the state we've gotten and at the cost to whom and who we've stolen from, and lied to, and in many cases murdered. And so there's this place, like once there's unnumbing, right? Once there's awareness, the instant second, the ricochet effect is I feel bad, right? The minute I really can look at what my nation has done and is doing, I feel crappy. And the minute I feel crappy, I now, from this place of guilt, my dominance stays in place because I'm doing everything from a place to not feel so bad about myself. And I think it's hard, in the work of service learning, right? There's, unfortunately, that can be tied in so intimately of, I'm going to do this to feel a little less bad about myself. It can be also infused in philanthropy, in so-called charity work. I mean, that thread runs through a huge level of U.S. consciousness that we have not really begun to understand the implications of it and how it affects everything, every aspect of what social justice can look like on a global scale or on an intimate interpersonal scale. It's all levels.
Yeah. Just think deeply, Nanci. Erin, Nyeema.
One of the things I was thinking about in listening to Nyeema and Nanci is how so often in institutions, especially higher ed, or I work more in K-12, we look at access as the way to achieve equity. But really access isn't equity. Access providing an interpreter, providing service learning opportunities, like you were saying, Nanci, that doesn't fix the systemic problems, and that doesn't get to undoing the institutional racism, that doesn't get to the structural pieces that are that are oppressing some groups or giving others more privilege, such as like the privilege of English speaking. That's something I always try to think about. It's like, I have like you were saying, Nanci, privilege isn't just something like, oh wow, you have a lot of money or you have access to like a title. There's so many privileges I think we have to just remember that some of us have by just walking around. I have Asian women privilege. I can walk into many different rooms and not be seen with suspicion, or I can walk into a room and be part of the POC community. I can also walk into a white room, and while I'm not white, sometimes I can assimilate a little bit easier. And that's something I have to remember. But that access also doesn't, my using it, having it, I have to figure out when and how to use it to get to root out oppression, to root out racism, to call things in and to call things out. So that's something that I'm often grappling with around some of these conversations is, where do I use it? How do I use it? How do I push institutions like higher ed and K-12 to say like, yo, that's Fakequity. That feels good. Yeah, you're interpreting things. You're giving a kid a computer because right now they don't have one. But how can we really get to systemic fixes?
I think that's hard to ask an institution to do. Especially when that's not to the core of their mission. And so how do you get leadership to really think about, the impact they're having, and how do you get them to kind of support this work in a broader way? How do you get them to, not have diversity just simply for the numbers? But thinking about why it's important for all types of people to be in front of, classes of whether they're K-12 students or college students, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's sexual identity, whether it's religion, for students to see a Muslim, woman in a hijab up there. But it really is a challenge. And I think this term Fakequity should be, bounced around more on college campuses, because I think we do play into that often. And we show our numbers and we show our, brochures, and we talk about the service level stuff that we do. But, to say social justice, to say that that's the core of the work of my office, I remember having some tense conversations with my staff, white males, white females who were like, I don't think we should go that route. And I'm like, why are we tutoring? Like, let's get to the basis of this. Like, why are these children receiving, a half-ass education that I received like 30 some odd years ago, and it's still here? So I think it's really hard, and I would love to have Nanci like in our space, both you and Erin, to kind of have these conversations with our teams, because it's hard to kind of help people, deal with the individual, especially the people who work in this space, who think and I believe that they do come to it with the best of intentions, but unpacking all of that other stuff that society has put into them, that their families have put in, that their communities have put in, to really call that into question, so that we can get to the root causes of this work, and not just these surface numbers of civic engagement experiences or counts, but like, what are you doing to structurally change the communities you're in? Yeah. And it may not serve you as an institution to do that as an institution, but how do you stand up, call that out, and do that work?
Yeah, and that makes me also think about like the practitioners of color who are in this field, trying to kind of hold that space and what that feels like. Oftentimes when I'm doing trainings or workshops or speaking, I have notes from the field, and basically it's like sharing the microaggressions or aggressions that I have experienced as a practitioner of color in the field, and like breaking that down with folks, a group of folks from different backgrounds, but like, why is this problematic? Like, this is what somebody said to me. This is what somebody said to a student. Why is this problematic? And because oftentimes what I have seen and what I have experienced is that space is not held for us. And that's, how do we hold that for ourselves? How do we ask our centers, our institutions, or how do we create that space outside of the institution to hold that space for all of those things? One of the things I appreciate when Nanci does her trainings and the trainings that I've been at, like, there are these breakout sessions where there are folks of color who go into a space and white folks who go into a space. And we've done that in some of our workshops. And what comes out of that has been so powerful, at least in what I've experienced. The other thing I would say that kind of reminded me of what you were talking about, Erin, in terms of access is, you know, a lot of these, especially Hispanic serving institutions, right? They get access to this federal money by designation of the amount of Latinx students that they have. But when I was at one, the conversation was, are we a Hispanic serving institution or a Hispanic enrolling institution? Right. And so where we count the numbers, but where are we actually doing the service? We create the access, but are we actually ensuring that they graduate, that they're, you know, have the skills, knowledge, abilities to be successful after, you know, are they laid down with debt? Are they, all of these questions about what does it actually mean to serve this group of students that we are like this with when that designation comes.
That makes me think, does the Hispanic and Latinx conversation get to direct what they want to learn? Do they have agency to say, like, we're here, we want to see these classes, we want to see this happen, this is what we need? Or is it really a service model?
I'll share a really brief personal story, which is that as an undergraduate, I attended Yale University, and I really wanted to go to Puerto Rico. I wanted to study in Puerto Rico. I wanted to learn about my Puerto Rican family. I had grown up mostly around my Mexican American family in Detroit, but not my Puerto Rican family. And I remember there was no program. Like, the largest communities of color in New Haven, where Yale is based, are Puerto Rican and Black. And I could go to Spain. I could go to any European nation and I would have gotten funded and I would have gotten full credit. But I had to go on my own. I had to apply separately. There was zero institutional support for that to happen. When I came back, they would not accept all my credits. I mean, it was just one barrier after another after another. And to me, it was this quintessential example of the colonial relationship that continues to persist in higher education, and how the burden is put on the student, often students of color, first-gen students, to try and, you know, we're freaking creative and we'll craft something if we think we deserve it and we can fight for it. But I know so many of us don't, and there were many things I gave up on, I'm sure. This was one that was so important to me, I didn't. But I think this is the place where we really have to question, like, where are we putting that money? Where are we putting those resources? And how are we not following the leads of the students and communities that we are in partnership with?
And that also makes me think of, like, the faculty and staff of color who are then trying to also push institutions in creating that space. I know when I was at DePaul, I worked with another Puerto Rican faculty member, and we created a program to Puerto Rico that we would have wanted to participate in as when we were students. And we did it, you know, through a service learning project. It was on transnationalism, so they had to do engagement here in the Puerto Rican community in Chicago, in Puerto Rico. We framed it in such a way that they went in the summer, but the classes they took were in the spring and the fall, so that they wouldn't have to pay extra tuition for those classes. And then, you know, I had access to resources at the center I was working at, so we also invested so that we could make the trip affordable for students. So the creativity that we have to bring, but that's if we're in those positions to do that. Yeah. We're about to open for questions.
I want that program. I still want that program.
Yeah, we're only able to do it twice because then I left, but you know.
And I think that's a really important piece that you raised there, because it wouldn't have happened without you actually being there. So this is why numbers do matter, and and investing in and recruiting, but not just recruiting, but retaining and supporting and ensuring the flourishing of faculty and administrators and staff from the communities that we want to partner with and consider ourselves partners with and in these institutions is key. And I think the other painful part is that when someone goes away, if it hasn't been built into the institution, it disappears.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know that.
Yeah.
Nyeema?
Yeah, I was just thinking about this when you were talking about, you know, access, recruitment, and retention, that a few years back, we started to think about that in our own work. I shared this story with you before. Like, I started to think about, just the whiteness of the space of community engagement, at the last Campus Compact conference after doing a plenary, and kind of looking out to the audience and not seeing, a broad representation of diversity. I just started to think about a number of questions, but thinking about specifically our historically underrepresented students. Were they participating in our efforts? What were their unique experiences? We were saying we were providing access to everyone, but were we really? And when we looked at our data, we used a report that the AAC&U and the USC Center for Race and Equity developed a race equity toolkit for engagement, and we found out that we weren't. And the response was, we're offering it. We're offering service learning courses. We're offering, study abroad. Like, why aren't they taking advantage of it? And so, what this toolkit helped us do to reframe that conversation to say, if there's any deficit, it's on the side of the university. It's on the side of the policy, not on the side of the student. And so once we started to look at our numbers and see that our African-American and Latinx students were not taking our service learning courses and getting the benefit of it, it was because we weren't even retaining them. So by the time most of the general population was taking the courses, we had already lost these students. But once we started digging into these numbers and, had a leader in our chancellor who was like, this isn't just Nyeema's problem. This is student success. This is institutional research. This is the dean's office. Everybody has to make sure that we're retaining these students that we fought so hard to get. So there are ways for universities to critically look back at themselves and then ask these hard questions, but then you have to change the policies. Mm-hmm. And once we did, our numbers shot up. African-American and Latinx students are taking these classes far more than anyone else. And we know why, because they feel this personal connection to this. They're graduating earlier, they're getting higher GPAs. That's a win for everybody, but you have to start by asking yourself these questions, hard questions, and then really be willing to change policy. So that's why I'm happy I sit at this seat, because I can drive that in a number of ways that others can't. Yeah. And I can sit there and say, what about Camden? What about the Black student? What about these other students of color? And what are we doing?
Yeah, and that's when it actually becomes a high impact practice, right? We talk about that language, but are we digging deep enough to actually see it manifested?
Kudos, Nyeema.
It's not pretty and it's not done, but at least we're starting. And you have
to celebrate the victories when we have them. Yeah. It's too hard to minimize them. That was a hard fought battle.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. And it really, leadership does matter. Being open to this idea of continuous improvement and deep institutional reflection, I think is important. I haven't seen any question. Oh, now I'm starting to get some questions. So let's see. Oh, actually, there's a bunch. Hold on. All right.
Just been chatting.
The first question is, how do you view processes such as racial caucusing within PWIs as a method for white folks to do self-work? And we'll open that up to anybody who wants to answer.
Well, I have a very particular slant, which is not to work from the privilege framework. So I think that can be a hard one, because I feel like particularly in woke spaces where everyone's wanting to do equity work as white allies, the work that we do primarily with white people in caucuses is for them to look at what they've lost. So what are the things that have come at the cost of being on the dominant side, the lies that they've internalized, but more importantly, the disconnection. And it actually sweetly or painfully ties back to what Erin said about speaking English. And so often we think of that as a privilege. When I really look at it, though, I've lost deep connections with my community and my family within a very short period of time, have lost several indigenous languages, African languages, and then the most recent colonizer, Spanish. I was raised a predominantly English-speaking environment, was not able to talk to my grandparents. Like, that quickly lost connection. And when I think about that for white people, they have very similar experiences unless they're recent immigrants. And so that's a place of connection that I can begin to relate to white people, and I'm talking U.S. context here, obviously, but there are many other places that white people feel loss and disconnection. And so that's a big piece of the work, is no longer operating from a privilege framework, but rather from one of loss. And I would say the other key piece is getting white people to unnumb. So this idea, well, there's probably two other pieces really quickly. So the unnumbing, because I think white people have been really told that they're better than, they have superiority stuff, and they know how to numb those feelings of what they've had to lose. And I'd say the other piece, which I learned from Lillian's mentor, is the idea of the phenomena of the good white and the bad white. So that is an unworkable frame. In our work, we start with the idea that all white people are good people. And so we're not into defending who's good and who's bad, and I'm better than so-and-so, but rather this idea that all white people are good people and all white people have been hurt, and that there's been a cost to that hurt, and that the result has been racist patterns, and that all white people carry those patterns. It's not a question of whether, but rather what is the work to heal, so that there's awareness for those patterns and they don't continue to perpetuate and collude.
So there's a follow-up to that I think kind of speaks to what you just mentioned. So how do we help start the project of unnumbing for dominant groups without running the risk of preserving white fragility and putting the burden on people of color and women to educate the dominant groups?
Oof, that has that's a half-day workshop, but let's see. Boom. And I don't have to be the one that answers this, so let me pause and just see if others, Nyeema, Erin. Okay.
Just like you.
Okay, then. So there's a couple of things I would say. One is, we as women, and we'll use the examples that they did, women and people of color, we need places to feel exhausted and to discharge exhaustion. Yes, it's a real thing.
Exhausted.
Yeah, thank you. Amen. And if I've really discharged that exhaustion, there's a part of me that is, I'm the perfect person to give them information. Like, I want to build the relationship. I don't want to educate them because, as like Nyeema said, what's the motivation? Like, this can't be transactional. I am giving this information because I care, because I want them to see me. I want them to know me. And I think this is the challenge for us as people of color, for women who are white. And we have to do it whether or not they will ever get us. And we have to want to know and understand and learn about them as well for the relationship. And I think that is the place that starts to feel like, well, I don't want to, I think one of the biggest disservices has been white tears and white fragility. I'm not on board with that stuff, because actually white people need to cry their eyes out, frankly. And they really need places to talk about what happened to them. Now, am I the person that should be listening to them? No. Can I be the person that listens to them? Yes. And when I have chosen to, and when I've done a body of work to be able to be in that position, it has been radically revolutionizing for me. I mean, I can't even describe what it's been like for me as a person of color to really see and understand what has happened systematically to white people, because it depersonalizes the anger and hurt that I feel, and I see them as emerging allies around the corner. Whereas when I didn't have that slack, I would write them off. I'd be like, waste of time, don't have energy for you, go read a book, take a class, educate yourself. I would be dismissive rather than invested in the relationship and the transformative nature of being in intimate connection with another human being.
Absolutely. So we've got time for one more question, and
Okay.
we'll try to get to the others and maybe follow-up sessions. I think there was a request if we could do a follow-up session with, and I'm down if you ladies are down, so we can try to work that out. So I agree that deeper institutional change is needed. Can you provide specific examples of how institutions can change to become more equitable and inclusive?
Go ahead, Erin.
Yeah, it's not a flip of a switch. You can't just say, hey, we are going to put together a task force and we'll give the task force 6 months to come up with a plan. Here's a plan, and if you go through all the steps. It's not that simple. It's an ongoing process. Nyeema talked about this. I'm sure, like, if the example you gave, Nyeema, probably took years, and it's paying dividend, 5 years. And it was probably a lot of personal work along the way, coaching people, getting small policies into place and doing things. And over time, it will change and it snowballs a little bit. But start doing something. Find one small thing that is doable and start with that and then build on it. Is it like if you're in charge of a department, can you take a once a week lunch where you bring your team together and say, we're going to like share an article. We're all going to watch a YouTube video and then come prepared to talk about what does it mean personally? What did you explore? What's interesting? And just start with that. And then over time, that's really simple. I mean, I don't want to dismiss it. I don't want to say like, that's going to change everything, but you have to do one thing within your control. A tool, because I know people like tools. On the Fakequity blog, if you look at like the January post, I put together a Fakequity 2020 pledge. So there's a bunch of, I think, 25 different things that I feel like are somewhat doable that you can choose to participate in. So it's like, maybe this year, like one of the challenges is we talked about language. And yes, there's a privilege with speaking English and there's also a loss. I realized this year, I spent a lot of time in English speaking spaces. And I read a lot of English-based literature, so I'm trying to challenge myself to find books by authors that were translated, because that will open me up to different ways of thinking. Hopefully, I have honestly not read anything other than Hello Kitty and Minecraft books during COVID. That's where my brain is at. But eventually, I hope to get back to something different. So that's something you could do, or watch a movie that was originally from a different. Isn't from the US or Canada or an European country. And those small things will kind of start to trigger little things, hopefully. They're not going to bring about institutional change, but those little things build to bigger systemic changes.
Absolutely. So we are at time, and I'm so sad because I think we could go on like this for a little while longer, but I just want to thank you, ladies, so much for agreeing to be in conversation about talking about this, about creating a space. So thank you so much. Check out the blog, check out Nanci's website, and check out Nyeema's work. Continue to check in with Campus Compact about love and be part of the movement that we're trying to build to change higher education. We're going to go on a 15-minute break. And then the next session that's up is The Road to Greater Justice and Equity, Lessons Learned Aligning Civic Engagement with Community College Priorities. So make sure you tune into that. And thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.